Hey, my name is Joash, and today I'm going to be presenting to you the topic that I've been preparing for the last few weeks. My topic is from the life of Moses, and the title of my message today is The Price of Anger. You see, Moses was a man who was very similar to us, more similar than you can imagine. He struggled with self-doubt, reluctance, and he also had a problem with anger, and his outbursts had serious consequences. All of us struggle with different things, and Moses was no different. Many characters in the Bible are actually no different. If we look at Noah, we see that he struggled with alcohol, yet he was described by God as a just man, perfect in his generation. We hear of David, who committed adultery in a very treacherous act. But after he repented, and throughout his life, he was considered a man after God's own heart. We hear of Saul of Tarsus, who later referred to as Paul. He used to kill Christians, but after God changed him, he became the writer of half of the New Testament. And the same is with Moses. Moses was a great man, but he struggled with anger throughout his life, and I'd like to take a look at his life today. So, here's my agenda for today. I'd like to cover the introduction of Moses and his moments of anger throughout his life, over injustice and what he learned from that, over Pharaoh's stubbornness, over the Israelites' idolatry, over the Israelites' murmuring, and finally we'll conclude with some thoughts about the topic. So let's begin. Firstly, we all have our faults. You see, Moses was a man who was blessed with leadership, intelligence, and unparalleled opportunity. He was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, and he was basically a prince of Egypt. He was raised in wealth with the highest education money could offer, with the most opportunity one could offer. He was at the pinnacle because Egypt was the great power of that time. And Moses, he was able to deliver the people from the bondage of slavery, a great and important task in Israel. Moses also established the laws and structure, giving Israel their identity. And Moses, who the Lord knew face to face, he struggled with anger, uncontrolled anger. Now, there are two types of anger: controlled anger and uncontrolled anger. What's uncontrolled anger? Well, uncontrolled anger is an anger that is destructive to ourselves and those we love. It's rage, not thinking about the consequences and suffering consequences, deep consequences later. Controlled anger is what motivates us to work for needed change. So I'll give you an example of controlled anger. In the temple, where Jesus' anger against the Pharisees, or in the temple, was controlled anger. He was angry at their sin and he wanted them to change. Uncontrolled anger, which we'll see in Moses' life, produces rage and produces actions that are not intended, that don't have a good outcome. So we'll go through that more throughout the slides. Okay, so firstly, let's see the anger, Moses' anger over injustice. So let's go over the situation. In Exodus 2, we see that Moses was living his life as a royal prince, and about at the age of 40, throughout his life, he started to identify with the enslaved Hebrews. And Moses at this time, when he started to identify with the Hebrews, we see in Hebrews 11:25, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward. So Moses, he started to identify with the Hebrew slaves rather than the luxuries of Egypt. And one day he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. And what did Moses do at this time? Well, Moses, who was more and more identifying with the Hebrew slaves, saw this taskmaster abusing this Hebrew slave, and he felt very, very angry. He was extremely angry and had a lot of rage. Well, we can read that passage in Exodus 2, verse 11. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he spied on an Egyptian smiting in Hebrew, one of his brethren. He identified with these people. Now, he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses, filled with anger, murdered the taskmaster who was abusing the Hebrew slave. What happened from this outburst of anger? Well, I can tell you two things. His anger in the first place was a healthy anger. He was angry at the injustice. But when Moses turned to his self to create the action of what he needed to do, he depended on himself. His solution to the injustice he saw was to slay the Egyptian who was mistreating the Hebrew. And that was a very, very bad thing to do, and it had severe consequences. Well, what was the outcome of the situation? Moses lost his power and authority because Pharaoh was furious. A Hebrew cannot be killing an Egyptian. It's just against their law. Moses fled Egypt, and he spent the next 40 years in the wilderness as a fugitive. So, what can we learn from this? Well, Moses lacked a lot of things, and he needed to grow up and depend more on God instead of himself, because the only solution he found to that problem was to kill the taskmaster out of rage. Perhaps if he didn't do that, maybe he would have been able to save the children of Israel from slavery in a different way, maybe in a faster way, actually. Maybe he could have influenced Pharaoh, but he lost that opportunity because he was filled with anger and he killed the taskmaster in his anger. So let's look at the lessons we can learn. Number one, humility. Moses needed to learn humility, and God took him to learn humility by taking him to that wilderness. Moses, Moses, who once was at the royal pinnacle, is now in a place that is very humbling, the desert. He is now leading not a nation, but tending to sheep. Another thing that's very humbling. And he's not in the service of the great Pharaoh, but in the service of his father-in-law, Jethro, in the desert. From royalty to a shepherd, Moses learned that to do things God's way rather than his way. That's the lesson he needed to learn. His way was not the right way to do it. The next thing we can learn is solitude with God. Moses really needed to spend time with God and learn who he was. And this can only happen. You can only learn who God is after you humble yourself. So after he humbled himself and learned humility, God appeared to him. And it is in the desert where Moses met God, the great I am, and witnessed the greatness of God. He witnessed so many different things, such as the the fiery bush, the bush that burned even though it was on fire, the serpent, when his rod, God told him to let go of his rod and turn to a serpent. God even told Moses to put his hand under his chest and take it out, and it became a leprous hand. And God did all these things to show Moses how great and wonderful God was, and that he needed to depend on him. So the next thing we can learn is dependence. Once Moses saw the greatness of God, he quickly understood that the only way to deliver the children of Israel from slavery was to depend on the Creator, because the Creator had far better solutions to the problems that were going on than Moses could ever come up with or do. So these are lessons Moses learned from after his anger. So let's move on to the next topic of anger. So next we see Moses' anger over Pharaoh's stubbornness. So God commanded Moses to go back and to deliver the people of Israel from the Egyptians. So Moses went to convey to Pharaoh to let his people go. And Pharaoh wouldn't have any of it. He didn't listen to Moses. Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the Israelites go. 10 times. Moses went to Pharaoh 10 times, but Pharaoh would not let the children of Israel go. Moses performed so many plagues that really besought Egypt. It started with the Nile turning into the blood, then the swarms of frogs, the dust became lice, the swarms of insects, the pestilence, the boils, the storm and the hail, the locusts, the darkness. Now, after that 9th one, Moses came again one last time to Pharaoh's presence. Let me read to you what happened. And Moses said, Exodus 11 verse 4, and Moses said, Thus saith the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts, and there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue, but against man or beast, that ye may know how the Lord doth put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these thy servants shall come down unto me, and bow down thyself unto me, saying, Get thee out, and all thy people that follow thee. And after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. So Moses came one last time to warn Pharaoh, this is the last straw. Your firstborn is going to die, and every firstborn in the entire nation will die. Only the Egyptians, not the Hebrews. And Moses said that to Pharaoh, and he left in a great anger. Now, in this situation, Moses did not sin. He was angry, but he did not act on his anger. He let God do the acting for him. What was the outcome? Well, Pharaoh hardened his heart again, and all the firstborns of the Egyptians died. And there was a great cry in Egypt. What did Pharaoh do right after that? Well, Pharaoh was so distressed and saddened by his firstborn dying that he urgently let the children of Israel go from the land of Egypt. What can we learn from this? Well, there's one big lesson. Moses had spiritual confidence in God. Moses showed great faith in God through all the plagues by obeying God's command, one after another. Moses did not act out in anger like he did 40 years ago by slaying the Egyptian. He obeyed God's commands and performed each plague as God had commanded. He depended and had spiritual confidence that God would deliver. He had spiritual confidence that what God said to him would come true. He had utmost confidence in God. And after Pharaoh let these people go, Pharaoh came and he hardened his heart one last time and went after the people again. And after, when the people were coming across the Red Sea, Moses had confidence that God had led them. He parted the Red Sea. What happened next? Moses had confidence that God was still superior. There was a pillar of cloud and fire to guide them through that sea. And finally, Moses had confidence that God intended to deliver them. He collapsed the sea on the Egyptians, letting none of them through and letting the Hebrews go free from the Egyptians' captivity. Moses' spiritual confidence in God had guided him through this hard time and helped him through, even through his anger with Pharaoh's stubbornness. Okay, let's move on to the next point of anger. So next was Moses' anger of the Israelites' idolatry. So what's the situation? In Exodus 32, we see Moses going to the top of Mount Sinai to receive God's laws on stone tablets. And when Moses, let me read Exodus 32 verse 1, and when the people saw Moses delay to come down out of the mount, they gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Make us gods, which shall go before us. What is wrong with these people? I really don't know. But the Israelites went ahead, crafted a golden calf, and began worshiping this idol. Now, while Moses was on the mount, God caught hold of what the Israelites were doing. Verse 7, Exodus 32, verse 7, and the Lord said to Moses, Go get thee down, for thy people, which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I have commanded them. They have made a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrifices thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. You see, after this, Moses stopped God from consuming them, but when Moses went down, Moses too was infuriated. And it came to pass, as soon as he came nigh to the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hands and brake them beneath the mount. And he took the calf which they had made and burnt it in the fire, and ground it to powder, and strawed it upon the water, and made the children of Israelites to drink of it. Now, you may think it's a little extreme what Moses did. And him even breaking the 10 Commandments was a little bit extreme. But Moses did not sin in this regard. His anger was directed at the sin of the Israelites. God did not punish Moses for any of the actions he did. Moses was against the sin. What was the outcome? Well, Moses punished the children of Israel. 3,000 people were slain, and God additionally plagued the people for making the calf. What can we learn from this? Well, even though we see Moses behaving very angrily toward the children of Israel, he was very, very compassionate towards them. Moses had compassion for them. Moses reminded God that Israel was his chosen people and dissuaded God from destroying them. We see in verse 11, and Moses besought the Lord and said to God, why doth thou wrath wax hot against thy people, which thou hast brought forth out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? He reminded God that this was the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, who God swore and said, I will multiply your seeds as the stars of heaven, and I will give you this land, and you shall inherit it forever. So God dissuaded his anger. Furthermore, in verse 30, Moses went to God to repent on behalf of the children of Israel. In verse 30 it says, and it came to pass on the morrow that Moses said unto the people, ye have sinned a great sin, and now I'll go up to the people, peradventure I shall make an atonement for your sin. And Moses returned unto the Lord, and said, O this people have sinned a great sin, and have made them gods of gold. Yet now if thou wilt forgive their sin, and if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book which thou hast written. And the Lord said unto Moses, whosoever hath sinned against me, him shall I blot out of my book. Therefore now go, lead the people in the place which I have spoken unto thee. Behold, my angel shall go before thee. Nevertheless, in this day when I will visit their sin upon them. So God spared the people of Israel. He was really going to kill everyone except Moses and redo his nation all over again. But because Moses had compassion for the people, he offered himself as a substitute to be blotted out of God's book instead of them, if God would not forgive them. So we see Moses as a leader learn compassion for his people, even though they were a stiff-necked people who provoked himself and God toward great anger against them. This is one lesson we can learn from Moses. He was very compassionate, even though he had anger against these people. So let's move on to the final outburst of anger. So over here we have Moses' anger over the Israelites murmuring. So let's go over the situation. The situation is in Numbers chapter 20. And here the Israelites are in the desert of Zin. And time after time, this is about 38 years in the wilderness, and they are ungratefully complaining as always. And God goes and commands Moses to speak to the rock to produce water for the people. And what does Moses do? Well, let's see in Numbers chapter 20, verse 10. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said unto them, hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. Now, what do we see over here? Moses is so fed up with the people, and he strikes the rock twice in anger instead of speaking to the rock as God commanded him to. This was a very grave mistake for Moses. What was the outcome? Well, in verse 12, and the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, and said, because ye believed me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. This was a fatal blow for Moses. Moses disobeyed God and now is forbidden from entering the promised land. You see, his life's mission for the last 40 years was terminated just short of its goal. Moses disobeyed God, and Moses took out his anger on the children of Israel and in turn was punished severely. What can we learn from this? Well, the one thing we can learn is you are accountable to God. It doesn't matter how close you are to God or how much you've done for God. There are consequences for each and every sin we commit. Moses undid decades of serving the Lord in a mere instant. How sad it is for Moses. It reminds me of a movie that once premiered where there was a man with who was an exceptional athlete and he was a great baseball player. And on his way to the major leagues, he made one really foolish choice and that took it all away. Years later, he's in his hospital bed and is explaining his life to one of his friends. And these are the words he says: some mistakes you never stop paying for. And this was one quote that probably resounded with Moses. That one instant of disobeying God and not following his commands led to Moses not being able to enter the promised land, his life's mission. What a hopeless thing, really, that is. 5-second decision hampered 40 years of service for God. Now, this is the nature of the choices we make. Our lives rise and fall and turn to our choices, and sometimes they're never the same because of the choices we make. We need to watch ourselves and be accountable to God because the choices we make are extremely important. So those are the 4 topics that I want to discuss with you this morning. Let's conclude and summarize what we have learned today. So what we learned is there are 2 types of anger. Anger against sin and anger that leads to sin. Anger against sin is the controlled anger, and anger that leads to sin is uncontrolled anger. If you're struggling with uncontrolled anger and it leads you to sin, there are a few steps you can do as we learned with Moses. Number 1, you need to spend some alone time with God and really humble yourself. You need to humble yourself and rely on God to carry out his plan in our lives. We also need to remember that we are still accountable to God, and every single small sin we commit and decision we make does affect us. We need to remember that. Now, you may ask, okay, how can I control my anger? Well, you can control your anger by those 3 points I mentioned, but what shows you've controlled your anger is when you show spiritual confidence in what God has planned, and when you show compassion and mercy to even those who anger you, just like Moses did. So, in conclusion, if you're a believer, don't lose sight of your dependence on God. The only answer for anger is seen in the example of Christ, who humbled himself in obedience to the Father's plan and purpose. He could have been angry with the people crucifying him or persecuting him, but he did not. He acted in humility. He did not act in self-assertion or anger. And the same way when Moses was humble, he was very useful to God. But when his anger took over, he dishonored him. We need to learn from Moses' example, both good and bad, to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God. 1 Peter 5, verse 6 says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." May God bless all of you. This is the message I had for you today. I hope you can apply it into your lives, and I hope we all can learn to control our anger throughout the days of our lives. May God bless you, and I hope you guys stay safe. Thank you.